This is the 20th video of the Forged Fiction series. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, check out the Forged Fiction playlist on our channel. You can click on the link in the description or click the card in the top right corner of the screen. To this point in the series, we have discussed many forgeries and pseudonymous letters, but no book in all of the New Testament canon stands out as much as 2 Peter as a forgery. For every other forged book, it is relatively easy to find someone arguing for their authenticity. That is not the case for 2 Peter. This one is so obviously a forgery that even the most fundamentalist scholars agree. It had multiple functions, but its main focuses are on the condemnation of false teachers and the second coming. Since the days of Paul himself, Christians have believed that Jesus was returning in their lifetime. I had a recent run-in with a Ray Comfort sycophant telling me this, but then when I pointed out the history of this idea, he backtracked and claimed we were already in the end times and Jesus had already begun his 1,000-year reign. He also claimed that the end days began when Jesus was resurrected. Apparently, he missed the memo that it's been about 2,000 years since then. It didn't even work in his own theology. The point is, this view has permeated all of Christian history. Paul thought Christ was coming back, and so did most Christians of his day. As time progressed, and there was no second coming, people either had to make bad apologetics for this, or just claim that others needed to be patient. These discussions on the second coming, or parousia, resulted in some of the contents of 2 Peter. Last time, we discussed 1 Peter, and I laid out the arguments for it being a forgery. So today, we need to discuss 2 Peter, and we first need to date it. The author clearly knows of 1 Peter. He presumably references it in 2 Peter 3:1. Dear friends, this is now my second letter to you. I have written both of them as reminders to stimulate you to wholesome thinking. This letter was clearly written afterward. It was written in a time when Christians were beginning to question their faith as there had been no second coming yet. A later dating for this is clear when we look at 3:4. They will say, "Where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." The talk of ancestors dying since the promise of a coming end shows this was written after the apostolic age. The author even takes verses from Jude and transforms them to fit his purposes. Jude is also a later forgery that came before this letter, but that will be left for later in this series. The usage is clear in nearly 20 verses. What's really striking is that the parallels come in pretty much the same order. The specific ideas in Jude are usually paralleled in a corresponding place order in 2 Peter. Here are just a few examples. Jude 7. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. Here's the transformation in 2 Peter 2:6. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. We can also see a clear parallel in Jude 11. Woe to them! They have taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. They have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion. And 2 Peter 2:15. They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. Aside from a brief reference in Revelations, these are the only two places in the New Testament that mention Balaam. We are also faced with the question of who the letter is directed to when discussing false teachers. We have good reason to believe the opponents were the Gnostic groups. The author describes these false teachers as being bold and arrogant, but claims they speak of things they don't understand. This would be a reasonable criticism against the Gnostics, since they asserted secret knowledge. The author of 2 Peter also claims that they have no problem heaping abuse at celestial beings. This is likely in reference to those Gnostics that condemned the God of this world, Yahweh, as an evil, lesser God. This would indicate a late date, probably sometime in the 2nd century, when the Gnostic movement began to flourish. Before that, there were many ideas which could clearly be called Gnostic, but from our sources, it seems they had no coherent theology until later. This applies to the proto-orthodoxy as well. To end off this episode, let's discuss some of the textual history of 2 Peter. One of my favorite textual variations occurs in the second line of this letter. 2 Peter 1:2 reads, "Grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God and of our Lord Jesus." Our earliest witness to this Catholic epistle, P72, dating to the late 3rd or early 4th century, contains a minor but important scribal change. It is the omission of the single word "and" before "of our Lord Jesus." turning the verse into "Grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God, our Lord Jesus." This changes the meaning entirely. Now Jesus is to be seen as identical to God. It seems unlikely that this change was motivated by anything other than Christological controversies, which were at their apex at the time of the writing. This is corrected in nearly all modern Bibles, but it certainly would not have surprised me if they chose to keep the variation instead. The letter itself can be said to have been written in the early 2nd century. It makes sense that this would be the time one would forge a letter in the name of Peter. The importance of apostolic authorship was heavily pushed in the 2nd century, since every possible eyewitness would have been dead. The church became increasingly interested in the writings of the apostles. As a result, many writings were written under false names, claiming to be from apostles. Even claiming to be from Peter alone, we find 3 apocalypses and his own gospel, along with others. I think Bart Ehrman put it best. As with all testaments, this is a fiction put on the pen of someone already residing comfortably in their tomb. But that's all for this time. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and if you like the content, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. And if you really love us, consider supporting us on Patreon. Make sure to click that bell to get notified when we make a video, and check out our new website. Be sure to share if you learned something, and we'll see you next time.